There's a mistake a lot of people make when they think about survival. They believe storing food is enough. They fill their pantry with rice, pasta, beans, canned goods, and they feel prepared. But almost nobody asks the most important question of all. What happens when that food starts to spoil and you no longer have electricity to save it? Because in a real collapse, during a major blackout, in a prolonged crisis, or in any situation where the power grid disappears for days, weeks, or even months, preserving food stops being a household detail and becomes a matter of survival. And that's where most people fail. Because the one who survives is not the one who buys the most, it's the one who preserves food the best. Today, you're going to see how to preserve food without electricity for real, without depending on refrigerators, freezers, or modern appliances. We're going to talk about the methods that hold up best in a serious crisis, the ones that let you extend the life of your food, protect calories, avoid illness, and maintain a usable supply when everything else starts to fail. And stay until the end, because there's one silent mistake that ruins more food than heat, humidity, or insects, and almost nobody notices it until it's already too late. When we think about food, we usually think about buying more, buying cheap, buying in bulk. But the history of survival has never been only about stockpiling. It has always been about preservation. For thousands of years, human beings stored food without plugs, without freezers, without industrial plastic, and without supply chains. And even so, they survived winters, droughts, wars, sieges, and failed harvests, not because they had advanced technology, but because they understood something basic. Every food has an enemy, and every enemy has to be fought in a different way. Heat speeds up deterioration. Moisture activates mold, bacteria, and unwanted fermentation. Oxygen oxidizes fats and destroys flavor and nutrients. Light degrades vitamins and shortens shelf life. Insects can turn an entire sack of grain into garbage, and rodents can ruin in a single night what it took you months to gather. If you want to preserve food without electricity, you have to think like someone protecting resources in a hostile environment. It's not enough to throw everything into a cabinet and hope for the best. You need to understand which method works for which food and why. Because a legume is not preserved the same way as fruit. A root vegetable is not preserved the same way as meat. Something dry is not preserved the same way as something fatty. And that difference changes everything. The first big idea you need to lock into your mind is this. The easiest foods to preserve without electricity are the ones that already contain very little water, or the ones you can make contain very little water. Water is life, but it's also a problem. Where there is water, microorganisms thrive. Where there isn't, spoilage slows down dramatically. That's why one of the absolute pillars of any off-grid survival food system is dry storage. Rice, beans, lentils, chickpeas, oats, pasta, flour if you rotate it properly, dried corn, whole grains. These foods have a huge advantage. They provide a lot of calories, good stability, and a very long shelf life if they're stored correctly. And that "if" is enormous. Because one thing is for a food to be capable of lasting for years. A very different thing is for it to last for years in your house. The enemy here is not just time, it's the conditions. If you store rice or legumes in their original bags in a humid room with changing temperatures, exposure to light, and access for insects, you are not storing food long term. You are delaying a problem. The smart way to do it comes down to 4 barriers. Protect it from air, protect it from moisture, protect it from light, and protect it from pests. That's why airtight containers work so well, especially food-grade buckets, thick glass jars, or appropriate sealed bags placed inside rigid containers. The goal is simple. Create a stable, dry environment where the food stays dormant for as long as possible. And this is where a key difference appears between storing food for a few months and storing food for a long crisis. For the short term, well-sealed containers in a cool, dry pantry may be enough. For the long term, you need to think in layers of protection. Dry food, sealed container, insect protection, and a cool, dark, stable location. A sack of legumes stored carelessly can deteriorate much sooner than you think. The exact same food, properly protected, can stay usable for years. And we're not just talking about quantity, we're talking about safety. Because when a pantry fails during a crisis, you don't just lose food, you lose calories, you lose protein, you lose margin, you lose peace of mind. Beans and lentils, for example, are a true backbone of survival nutrition. They provide complex carbohydrates, fiber, minerals, and a very respectable amount of plant protein. They're not as convenient as an energy bar, but in a real crisis, they last much longer, feed you better, and make it possible to cook complete meals. That said, there is a catch. The longer they sit in storage, the harder they can become, and that means more water and more fuel to cook them. In other words, preserving food properly isn't just about keeping it from rotting, it's also about making sure it remains practical when you finally need it. That's why it makes sense to combine dry legumes with faster cooking options, or even with some ready-to-eat foods for immediate emergency use.
And that brings us to the second major method, dehydration. If dry storage is the king of stable foods, dehydration is the tool that lets you turn perishable foods into long-lasting reserves. Fruits, vegetables, herbs, mushrooms, meat, fish, even some properly prepared complete meals. The logic is brutally simple. If you remove most of the water, you slow microbial growth and massively extend shelf life. But there's a huge difference between drying something and drying it correctly. Because drying a food badly is a perfect recipe for making it look stable on the outside while still holding enough moisture inside to spoil. And that can be worse than not preserving it at all. When you dehydrate food, you are not just aiming for it to look dry. You're aiming for uniformity. You want the food to lose enough moisture consistently. No soft spots, no hidden moisture pockets, no thick pieces that turn into tiny shelters for mold and bacteria. Dried fruit has enormous value in survival because it concentrates energy, takes up little space, and adds psychological variety. And that last point matters more than it seems. In a prolonged crisis, food doesn't just have to feed the body, it also has to prevent the mental fatigue of eating the same thing over and over again. A few slices of dried apple, some dehydrated banana, sun-dried tomato, dried peppers, dried onion, dried garlic, dried herbs, all of that can turn a depressing pantry into a much more useful one. And on top of that, many of those foods can be rehydrated, cooked, or eaten as they are. Dried herbs, for example, may seem like a minor detail, but they are not. When access to fresh ingredients disappears, flavor becomes a morale tool. Food that tastes better is easier to tolerate, easier to use well, and gives you a sense of normality that becomes incredibly valuable in hard conditions.
But where dehydration becomes truly strategic is with animal protein. This is where many people make another mistake. They assume that without a freezer, meat simply has no solution. And that isn't true. It does have a solution, but it requires technique. Drying meat is not about hanging it in the sun and hoping for the best. It requires proper cuts, moisture reduction, hygiene, proper salting, and impeccable storage. When it's done correctly, you get a compact, portable source of protein that is far more stable than fresh meat. When it's done badly, you get a health risk. That's why, in survival, it's wise to be very conservative with this kind of process. If you don't fully understand the method, you're better off focusing on dry plant-based foods and leaving preserved meat for techniques you actually know how to do safely. And that brings us to an uncomfortable but extremely important principle. Not every traditional method is equally safe just because it's traditional. There are ancestral techniques that are brilliant, and there are old practices that we now know can go wrong if you don't truly understand them. So if we're talking about social collapse, long blackouts, and preserving food without electricity, the priority is not to do something authentic. The priority is to do something safe, repeatable, and useful. That's why the next method is so powerful: salt. Salt doesn't just add flavor. For centuries, it was a preservation technology, a strategic tool, almost a military resource. And when you understand why, you start seeing it in a completely different way. Salt works because it makes microbial life harder and helps draw out water. In practice, that allows certain foods to last much longer than normal, especially when combined with drying, curing, or controlled fermentation. Cured meats, salted fish, some vegetables, certain cheeses in the right context, ferments in brine. Salt can be part of several preservation systems, which is why it's one of the most valuable resources you can store. It doesn't spoil. It's useful for food, useful for preservation, and it also has basic medical and hygiene uses. But there is something very important to understand here. Salt helps. It does not perform miracles. A piece of food that is badly cured, still wet inside, handled with poor hygiene, or stored improperly, does not become safe just because it's salty. Salt is a barrier, not an absolute shield. Even so, in survival, it plays a huge role because it expands your options. It lets you treat food in ways that buy you time, and in a crisis, time means decision-making power. If you can turn a perishable surplus into something more stable, you've just avoided a loss. If you can cure, dry, or keep a food usable for a few more days without electricity, you've just bought yourself margin, and margin saves more than one situation. Now, there's another method that is even more interesting because besides preserving food, it transforms it: fermentation. This is one of the most fascinating processes of all because it turns ordinary vegetables into more stable foods with more complex flavor, and in many cases, foods that are easier for the body to tolerate. Sauerkraut, fermented pickles, carrots in brine, fermented beets, certain sauces, even some dairy products if you have the right knowledge and the right conditions. Proper fermentation does not depend on electricity. It depends on salt, cleanliness, correct ratios, reasonable temperatures, and patience. It is an alliance between the human being and beneficial microorganisms that take control before the harmful ones do. And that detail is crucial, because preserving food does not always mean stopping all microbial life. Sometimes it means encouraging the right kind of life.
That said, fermentation should not be romanticized. Fermenting badly can ruin food. Fermenting without hygiene can create problems. Fermenting without knowing which signs are normal and which signs are dangerous is basically working blind. But when the process is truly understood, it offers spectacular advantages. It allows vegetables to be preserved for long periods, improves flavor, adds variety, and reduces your dependence on ultra-processed foods. In a collapse, that isn't just useful, it's a strategic advantage. Because the food that lasts the longest is not always the most pleasant food to eat, and food that retains flavor, texture, and some sense of freshness can make a real difference in your ability to maintain a decent eating routine. Think about this. A sack of rice can keep you alive, but a pantry that also contains fermented vegetables, dried herbs, something sweet and stable, and a variety of foods can keep you functional for much longer. And in a prolonged crisis, functional is gold. Speaking of stable sweets, there are some foods that seem almost designed to survive time itself. Honey is one of them. Not because it is a complete food, because it isn't, but because it is an extraordinarily stable, useful, versatile, and resilient energy reserve. Properly stored, protected from moisture and contamination, honey can last an incredibly long time.
It can also sweeten food, improve boring meals, and serve as a quick energy source. In survival, that matters. You are not going to live on honey, but having foods that don't spoil easily and that improve morale while adding available calories is a real advantage. The same is true for sugar, and to some extent molasses as well. They are not the ideal nutritional foundation, but they are powerful storage tools. They provide energy, and in some contexts can even play a role in other preservation methods. The key here is not to confuse long shelf life with balance. A food can last a very long time and still not be enough by itself. That's why a good survival pantry is not built around a single superfood, but around complementary categories: dense calories, protein, stable fats, micronutrients, flavor, and ease of preparation. And now we come to one of the most delicate points of all: fats. A lot of people become obsessed with foods that last 20 or 30 years and forget that fats are often much more treacherous. Because what destroys many food reserves is not visible mold or obvious insects, it's rancidity. Oils, nuts, seeds, whole grain flours, nut butters, anything with a significant fat content needs more care, more rotation, and far less fantasy about its real shelf life. In a crisis, fats are incredibly valuable because they're calorie-dense and very filling, but they're also much more vulnerable to oxygen, heat, and time. And this is where the silent mistake I mentioned at the beginning shows up. People become obsessed with the date and forget about the type of food. Not everything that is stored ages the same way. A bucket of white rice properly stored can stay with you for years. A badly handled bag of nuts can turn rancid much sooner. Refined flour lasts considerably longer than whole grain flour. A whole grain lasts longer than ground flour. Why? Because the more processed, crushed, or exposed a food is, the more surface area it has in contact with oxygen, and the faster it can degrade. That one idea completely changes the intelligent way to build a reserve. It's not just about storing food, it's about choosing more stable forms of that food. Sometimes it's better to store the whole grain and grind it when needed. Sometimes it's better to store dry legumes rather than legume flour. Sometimes it's better to store base ingredients than foods that have already been too heavily processed. That gives you longer life, more control, and fewer nasty surprises.
There's another method that deserves serious attention because it was essential for centuries: natural, cool storage without electricity. No, I'm not talking about a refrigerator. I'm talking about cellars, root cellars, buried pantries, cool cupboards, underground spaces, and places protected from sunlight and sudden temperature swings. Root vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, beets, turnips, or onions can last much longer if they are kept in cool, dark, ventilated, and relatively stable conditions. It's not about stopping time, it's about slowing it down. A space like that won't give you years the way properly stored dry food can, but it can give you extremely valuable weeks or months with certain fresh foods, and that is huge. Because there is a big difference between surviving on dry food alone and supplementing that base with foods that still retain some of their original texture, culinary value, and freshness. In collapse scenarios, hybrid solutions are the smartest ones. Not everything has to last 25 years. Some things need to last months, others years. Others only need to last long enough to buy time while you consume and transform the most perishable foods first. That layered way of thinking is much more realistic than the fantasy of a pantry full of eternal food. And if we're talking about realism, then we need to talk about priorities. Because if the power goes out tomorrow for a month, the first thing that saves you is not advanced fermentation knowledge or expert meat curing. The first thing that saves you is having a base of foods that are naturally stable or that become stable through simple methods: rice, legumes, oats, pasta, salt, sugar, honey, powdered milk if you keep it sealed well and rotate it, dehydrated vegetables, dried fruit, dehydrated broth, dried herbs, and some acidic foods that have been correctly pickled or fermented. And along with all of that,
A small but constant rotation so that nothing gets forgotten until it becomes a mystery. Because another major key to food preservation without electricity is not the method, it's the habit. People imagine survival as a sealed warehouse that is never touched, but the intelligent reality looks much more like a living system. You buy, you organize, you label, you rotate, you inspect, you consume the oldest first, you replace what you use, you learn what works in your climate, you adjust containers, you check for moisture, you watch for insects, you improve storage locations. That isn't obsession, that is maintenance. And maintenance prevents you from discovering a massive loss at exactly the moment you need those foods most. Because an abandoned pantry looks like security until you open it and find moisture, weevils, swollen lids, strange odors, or rancidity. A well-managed pantry, on the other hand, gives you something very different: confidence. And confidence in a crisis reduces mistakes. Now, all of this is useless if you don't understand one final truth. Preserving food without electricity is not just a kitchen skill, it is a form of independence. Every well-sealed jar, every well-protected sack, every properly dehydrated food, every carefully made ferment, every root crop stored under the right conditions, all of that is autonomy. It means reducing your dependence on a fragile system. It means turning perishable food into time. It means creating margin when the system stops working the way it promised it would. And that is the big difference between someone who panics and someone who knows how to move through a crisis. One waits for someone else to fix the problem. The other has already thought about how to keep eating in the meantime.
Because in the end, when electricity fails, it's not just the lights that fail. Refrigeration fails, fast preservation fails, comfort fails, and if you weren't prepared, your food security fails too. But once you understand these principles, you stop looking at food the same way. You no longer just see products, you see moisture, you see stability, you see risk, you see duration, you see real usefulness, and you begin building a pantry that does not depend on an outlet to remain a pantry. If I had to summarize everything in one single idea, it would be this. In a crisis, the most valuable food is not the most expensive and not the most modern. It's the food that remains safe, useful, and edible when everything else is no longer available. That is the food that gives you options, the food that buys you time, the food that helps you think clearly, the food that turns a critical situation into a manageable one. And that is why learning how to preserve food without electricity is not a curiosity from the past, it is a skill for the future. One of those skills that seems exaggerated until the day it suddenly doesn't.